Well, it's that time of year again, the time when politicians love to hear their name mentioned, but only if it's being praised. But this night is not all about praise. The best and worst of the year gone by, as picked by At Issue. Everyone is in the house tonight. Andrew Coyne, Chantal Hébert, Althea Raj, and Jennifer Ditchburn. So let's get started right away with the political high point of the year. Andrew, what was it?
This will seem an odd choice, perhaps, because in some ways it might even be a low point, but I think the work of the Electoral Reform Committee set a standard in terms of people taking the job seriously, dealing with complex subject matter, dealing with their obvious biases of their political parties, and yet somehow able, I think, to work together in a collegial way that we don't see often enough, shall we say. And while the eventual report was flawed, as many compromises are, I think it did provide a roadmap for the government to proceed with if it was of a mind to.
That's the nicest thing he said about that whole process.
Rarely have so many disagreements being so well papered over. I picked not the law itself, but the debate over medically assisted suicide, because I thought it showed Parliament at its best. People, MPs, senators, did not play politics with the issue. They took it to heart. I think the people who spoke in both houses were sincere in their views. And in the end, came down to what is a compromise that was not a happy compromise for many protagonists, but it did show Parliament as the way it should be.
Althea.
I agree. I think that not the legislation, but the process itself, the idea of having a joint, both houses, all parties, come together to propose ideas to the government, and then pre-studies and really thoughtful debate, and everybody kind of broke from their scripted partisan lines. And you got a sense very early on that this year, perhaps things would be different in the House of Commons and in the Senate, and also gave senators a chance to prove their worth. So I think that was definitely a high point.
Jennifer.
I would say the Pan-Canadian agreement on climate policy, just because when you think of the past almost 20 years of governments saying they're going to do something on climate change, and we finally arrived at a point where something's happening with all of the provinces minus Saskatchewan being on board. I think it's an important political achievement. We can debate whether the policy mix is right, whether it's going to work, but really, I mean, that they came to an agreement is pretty substantial.
All right, so those are the high points. Low points, Chantal.
The Conservative leadership campaign, and in particular Kelly Leitch's choice of dog whistle politics to try to set herself apart from the competition. It's one thing to want to debate integration and immigration, and it is another to seize on or manufacture fractures in society to try to set yourself apart from the competition. I don't find her a credible candidate for the so-called populism that she claims to represent, and I think she is taking the party down a very dangerous path that will turn out to be divisive for the Conservatives more than for Canadian society.
Well, they've got until May to determine how divisive it gets and whether you're correct on that one, Althea.
I would pick the negotiations over healthcare funding with the provinces and the federal government. The Trudeau government was very successful in getting the provinces on board on the Canada Pension Plan expansion. They were very successful, as Jen mentioned, on the environment. But here came an issue that was really important to the provinces. And basically, Ottawa said, take it or leave it. We've been telling you for a year that we want to have certain benchmarks. But even the provinces who took part in that process, who sent Ottawa, this is what we want to spend the money on, heard nothing. There was no negotiations. The federal government basically knows how to negotiate when it cares about an issue. And on this issue, the federal government decided it didn't want to play ball.
Jennifer.
I would, similar to what Chantal was saying, I would say it's sort of this dark, divisive rhetoric that's coming up from the United States and into Canada. Whether it's politicians showing up at a rally where you hear people say, lock her up about a democratically elected premier, whether it's anti-Semitic acts that we saw where I live in Ottawa, Islamophobia, Canadians saying that they're hearing things in the streets, white supremacist posters going up in Toronto. I mean, this is low, very low, and it's unfortunate some politicians are trying to capitalize on this kind of rhetoric.
Andrew.
I would say the defeat of Tom Mulcair at the NDP convention. I'm not saying it was the wrong choice, and politics is a brutal game, and they're all big boys and big girls playing it. But just on a personal level, I mean, Joe Clark bowed out as Conservative leader when he only got 66%. To get 48% was pretty humiliating. I think you have to say he brought it on himself. He should have been able to see where the winds were blowing, but just, as I say, just at a human level, it was hard to watch.
Which cabinet minister wins MVP for 2016? Althea, you start.
Chrystia Freeland. I think that she took a bit of a gamble and some flack for pulling out of the negotiations and saying that if the European Union couldn't get CETA done with a country as nice and with such European values as Canada, who could they do business with? And, you know, she was treated in the House of Commons as suggesting that she needed adult supervision, but she basically was given a deal that seemed like it was dead. And she negotiated an interpretive declaration that calmed some of the left-wing governments in Europe, and she got this deal done. And in a rare show of cross-partisan support in the House of Commons, she reached across the aisle, gave Ed Fast, who negotiated this deal for the Conservatives, a big hug, and it was a nice moment. I think she did a good job.
Jennifer.
I would say Jane Philpott. If you think about the beginning of the year, the health minister was the head of the committee that was handling the huge movement of Syrian refugees. She's dealt with physician-assisted suicide, the fentanyl crisis, the ban on asbestos, and now she'll be dealing partly with marijuana and this health accord. Now, whatever you want to say about the negotiation with the premiers, I think Jane Philpott is regarded as a serious policy person, not hyper-partisan, and someone who commands respect from people who deal with her.
Andrew.
I guess I'd say Bill Morneau, the finance minister. I don't necessarily agree with each of the things that he was involved in, but you know, the fortunes of this government, for good or ill, and for the country, will be greatly determined by that first budget he brought in and everything that will follow from that. The agreement on the Canada Pension Plan was a pretty major achievement, and not one that I agree with again, but obviously significant. And this very radical policy on the infrastructure bank, where they're going to involve a lot more private capital, a lot more user pay than we've been accustomed to in this country. These are all pretty significant steps, and he was in the thick of all of them.
All right.
I
Chantal.
too picked Chrystia Freeland. Everyone remembers her walking out from that session, but there was a lot of hard work that went into getting there. And if the expression "to herd cats" applies to what she did in the case of this agreement, and it is a significant achievement. I think people who supported the agreement, like Jean Charest, who was one of the forces behind it initially, believed that it was probably dead on arrival last summer.
Which opposition critic, either party, MVP? You start, Andrew.
My choice would be Nathan Cullen, who was the point man, obviously, on the electoral reform type of issue.
For the NDP.
For the NDP. As badly as the government has handled that issue, I think they were also outfoxed on a couple of points by the NDP. That the motion to get the parties represented on the committee in proportion to their vote rather than in the usual way, which would give their government automatic majority. I think, crossing over, if you will, and making a deal with the Conservatives on a referendum, I think gives it whatever flickering chance it has of succeeding. And I think just generally was a thorn in the government's side, a very effective critic.
Chantal.
I picked Rona Ambrose. No one has held the job of interim leader of the opposition for as long as she will. Usually you do it for 4, 5, 6 months. This is going to be almost mid-mandate. She's trying to hold together a caucus that has, a strong proportion of people running for the leadership. And still that ship tends to run on time, and question period is orderly. I hear she spends much of her time trying to arbitrate internal discussions, but it is not easy to hold the fort and not engage the party on positions that the next leader might not agree with and still look like you're effective in opposition.
She still says she's not in any way interested
I
in
believe
running
her.
for leader herself, and the party rules say she can't, but more and more people are suggesting she should. Althea.
I also picked Nathan Cullen for many of the reasons that Andrew mentioned, but I think every time Nathan Cullen speaks, it reminds New Democrats why he should probably be in that race to lead their party. He oozes authenticity, yet he's extremely politically savvy. He's got the policy chops, and he did outsmart the government, not just on the makeup of the committee, but it seems like the government didn't think several steps ahead, whereas Nathan Cullen was several steps ahead of them. And if we have a form of PR, it is because of Nathan Cullen.
Jennifer.
I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to say a trio. So Nathan Cullen, Scott Reid, and Elizabeth May, who are all on the Electoral Reform Committee, and did really yeoman's work in terms of research, interest in the policy work, and went on more than 60 committee meetings, and we're really committed to the process. So I'd say those three.
All right, we're just about out of time before we take our first break, so we've got to whip through this quickly here. What was the most mishandled issue of the year? Chantal?
Electoral reform by the Liberals. I think I would stop her sentence about not thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead in the case of the government at the word not thinking. Because that is what we watched. There was like an improvisation contest, and it is still ongoing incredibly to this day. We don't have a clue what the government's thinking is on its own promise.
Althea?
I agree. Electoral reform, every step of this process has been bungled. I don't know how they're going to dig themselves out of it, and I have no idea what the result is. And like Chantal, I think the government doesn't know either.
All right. Well, everybody's seemingly in agreement on that. So let's move to the next one. What was the most overblown political story of the year, Jennifer?
Justin Trudeau's vacation. I just
Which one?
thought I'd throw it.
Sorry.
Well, I wrote something about it in the summer, but good God, do we really care that he's having a vacation with his kids and that someone took a photo of him? I mean, this went on for weeks, whether he was taking too long and whether it was appropriate for him to be photographed by people. And I just thought, wow, this is silly. Politicians deserve vacation time and they deserve time with their family.
Andrew?
Elbowgate. Justin Trudeau walking onto the floor of the House of Commons to try and guide an MP to his place so he could vote. Inadvertently bumps into somebody in the process. She happens to be a woman, and everyone goes bananas. Some MPs claiming that they didn't feel safe anymore in the House. All kinds of identity politics being played with it. A bunch of people should have known better, wondering whether this is going to be the end of Justin Trudeau's, prime ministership. It was as if everybody lost their mind for about 48 hours.
Including us. We even talked about it one night. Most overblown story of the year, Althea?
I think it's Elbowgate as well. I think it was like if the opposition MPs had been withholding all their feelings about losing the elections and then managed to dump it all out. It was a bad thing. The Prime Minister should not have done it, but the opposition made it worse.
All right. Jennifer, what was the most underreported political story of the year?
Okay, so I'm going to get some groans about this, but I think that the sort of the doom inside the news media, I think people don't realize what's happening in the industry and the fact that we could be losing major newspapers across the country, local news outlets, and that we need a really big reflection and a national conversation about what happens when you don't have credible news organizations anymore. I think that people aren't talking about that
And
enough.
I think it's more than just print.
Oh, way more. Much
you know.
more than print. Yeah. Look what's happening in the United States as an example of, what happens.
But should it be politicians who are leading this conversation? Because this underreported political story of the year, I'm as wary
politicians,
of politicians taking the lead on this as what is happening to our business.
But politicians don't need to lead a political story either. It could be a national conversation about what happens to our democracy when you don't have journalists.
They could engage in national conversation and
Yeah.
stay out of it themselves in some ways. Okay, very quickly here. Most significant promise the government kept in the year, Andrew?
I'll say the Canada Child Benefit in terms of, we'll see what happens with the carbon tax, but this is something which was a very well thought out reform, bundling together a number of existing benefits. And in terms of concrete impact on people's lives, it's going to lift thousands of children out of poverty. That's a pretty big achievement.
Chantal?
Proactiveness on the climate energy file rather than sit back and say we've approved this pipeline and then let it go, or climate change will take care of itself, to try to marry the two together. I'm not sure it's going to work on either front, but it is overdue and it was promised.
Most significant one they broke, Althea.
Budget deficits, $10 billion. Whoops.
That was the promise.
That was the
And it's
promise, and now
30
they're
plus, right?
Well, latest forecast was 25 without the $6 billion cushion. So, but in any case, several times larger than the government said it would be.
And with no visible plan to get out of it.
Exactly.
It's more of an obligation that wasn't kept, and that's to give equitable funding to First Nations for child welfare. What's happening? They've been told by the Human Rights Tribunal. They still haven't provided the funding. So.
Right. Still arguing over that one. Cindy Blackstock's very much engaged against the government on that. All right, time for that quick break and then a quick peek into the future. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. Andrew, Chantal, Althea, and Jennifer all here tonight. Time to look into 2017 Starting with this question, what is a challenge the government faces right away as the new year begins?
The pipeline question. This is going to be shaping up to be an absolute battle royal over the Trans Mountain Pipeline. It's going to really test this government, but if they're able to get it built, potentially has huge political gains for them.
Chantal.
Fundraising. I don't think that it's going to go away over the Christmas break, and I don't think they've managed to put the issue to rest.
Althea.
Electoral reform, and we'll know pretty soon what they intend to do if they bring forward changes to the Referendum Act.
Continues to be keeping promises. They have several reviews, policy reviews that are coming to an end or have been coming to an end. So defense, international assistance, Canadian content, blah, it's all happening in 2017.
Right.
Yeah. So
Two leadership races in 2017, Tories, of course, and the NDP as well. Who is the Conservative to watch?
I'm watching Maxime Bernier because he can bring a lot of support from Quebec. He doesn't seem to have a lot of competition there, and he seems to have the broadest support because of that advantage. So I expect him to be in those top ballots or kingmaker.
Althea.
Kevin O'Leary. He recently spoke to a bunch of Conservative caucus MPs who went there not liking him and came out of there saying rather glowing things about him. So I think if he decides to jump in, he has a very good shot.
okay, I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to say.
Again?
Yes, I know. I love to cheat. Now I'm going to say the sort of progressive conservative type candidates. So Lisa Raitt, Michael Chong, Erin O'Toole. Will they be able to keep progressiveness alive in the Conservative Party, or is it going to disappear with this leadership race?
Andrew.
I'll say Bernier as well. The biggest question mark over him is his personal sort of leadership judgment and character in these kinds of questions. He's run a very impressive campaign so far. I think very well considered, well thought out, and at particular moments I think has struck the right note, which is that's one of those tests of political judgment, is are you able to say the right thing at the right time?
The NDP. Nobody in so far. Althea, who's to watch?
Jagmeet Singh, who's the deputy leader of the Ontario NDP. He's a young guy, 37, charismatic, kind of makes you think a little bit about Trudeau. And if he decides that his political future lies in federal politics, I think that's going to be interesting to watch.
Nathan Cullen. And I think for some of the reasons that we talked about, his performance in the House and so on, and he's seasoned MP. Yeah.
Andrew.
I'll be interested to see whether Tom Mulcair runs to succeed himself. We saw that in Manitoba, where the Premier of Manitoba ran after being brutally beaten up by his own party. It's not inconceivable that at the end of the day they could say, you know what, we made a big mistake.
That would be quite the story.
He says no, though.
I think
Of course he
Mulcair,
says. They all say no.
but I think Mulcair would only do that, and I don't think he would, but if he was not having to run against other serious candidates, because why would he run for his own job? It's a recipe for disaster always. Look at Joe Clark.
What? Who are you looking at?
I'm looking at Nathan Cullen and Megan Leslie and people like that to change their minds and give their party a bit of a leadership contest.
Well, there sure isn't one at the moment. Which
So
leads
sad
to
we
that
didn't
kind
say
of talk,
any of the
right?
two people who are actually taking time to think about it.
Yes,
Right.
it's something. Well, we are helping them think.
But a lot of them are looking at it and going, what are my odds of, if I do win the leadership, of doing anything except sitting on the opposition benches?
Maybe they want to see what happens with the other guys first.
Yeah.
You know. Anyway, thank you all.
Thank
Giving
you.
us lots to think about the year gone by and the year ahead. So with that, we close the book on 2016 and look forward to another year of political action in 2017. We hope you'll keep following it all with us. We have some great holiday panels coming up in the next week, including At Issue versus the Insiders, their annual quiz show. Until then, all the best, and the National returns right after this.